Welcome to Dark Sorcery. I'm Alfredo Martinez, and I have with me Sionnach. Sionnach, it's good to have you on.
Good to be here.
All right, man. So we're going to talk about Norse magic.
Okay.
But first of all, go ahead and tell a bit how your spiritual journey began.
For me, I was raised in a Swedish, Irish American family that kind of practiced its roots in different forms of magic. Like on the Swedish side, a lot of it was just kind of passed down over the ages, and what little was left is pretty much what survived the Christian takeover of Europe.
Right.
And when my family came over on the boats, most of it was just, well, did you know if you do this, it has this, or when this happens, it means this. The typical witchcraft that you hear, old wives' tales, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then a lot of it was like fire scrying and stuff like that, because my grandma always used to tell me, if you look in the fire and stare long enough, you'll eventually see the future, and it'll show your future as well as other futures. And that got me thinking very early on, like, what do you mean? And then I found out that my grandma and my mom both practiced witchcraft. Most of the stuff that was available that they did their own research on to get back in touch with that was all Wicca based. But as anybody who gets into the occult, they start branching out from one area to another until they find what feels closer to their path. My grandma practiced a little bit with the runes, and she always was like very hazy to deal with that, especially when you're a kid. It's like, yeah, that's powerful stuff for you. You don't need to worry about that, which you later find out magic's only dangerous if you go into it half cocked, because a child practices magic all the time and doesn't realize it, and there's no harm, no foul, versus when you're an adult and your intentions are ill, it just, it backfires and you end up suffering for it. So it's usually adults that screw themselves over with magic. So further in, I got into my teenage years and I wanted to seek out my own stuff. I've always been more drawn towards the darker side of magic and how it's practiced. And I always wanted to get into things like necromancy, blood magic, stuff like that, which when you get into your Celtic roots, you start finding out that was pretty much like the majority of the stuff was all blood magic, because all their stuff is based around life and death. It's very nature based, and finding there's a balance with that, light versus dark, and so on. Well, with Norse magic, the more I found out about my roots being in Scandinavia, I started understanding that a lot of the stuff that I was taught when I was a kid is our family comes from one of the berserker bloodlines. And we were always told from my great grandmother that we came from the berserkers, And here's this lady that was the first generation born in America from our Swedish roots. And her mom told her the same story, that we came from berserkers. And I never understood that, but everyone in our family that obviously shows that they're berserkers has a bit of a temper, and the temper is not like most people. And when you start looking into those roots, you start realizing certain things just make more sense. So naturally, the seeking of truth and knowledge, you start going down more and more rabbit holes, you start finding more and more books. And then I found essentially Alfredo, which is Norse paganism, but it's an Icelandic term that word for word just means the worshiping of the old gods or following the old gods. I started looking into that, and next thing you know, I start finding out that the majority of the magic that was practiced, that we can actually find like written definitions of what the different types of magic mean. Like most of the names, we don't know what they mean. So there's no telling if these were just different branches or different names, because there's many different types of names that mean the same thing. Like divination and scrying are...
So I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but so
No, you're
would you
good.
agree that there's really no universal agreement on like the origin of the runes?
When it comes to magic, I would say it obviously has to originate somewhere
Right.
because everything has a beginning. But because so much of the old ways were passed down orally and not through transcripts, there's almost no way to truly track how far back and where it originates. Because my understanding and how I've studied magic started both from when I was a kid and being told this is how magic works, as well as on the side going, but why? And when you ask yourself why, you become kind of a skeptic because most people can't answer the why when it comes to magic. So I kind of leaned a little more towards the atheistic side of, well, science is the one true religion. And clearly, if you can't prove it, it doesn't exist. But then some things just don't add up. And the more I studied science, the more a lot of what I learned in magic started to make sense. And I started drawing those correlations. So to me, science and magic are one and the same. Just magic leans more towards this is what I know works. If I put A plus blue equals triangle, science wants to know why A plus blue equals triangle.
Yeah, I think it is helpful to look at both sides because I mean you can study all the magic you want and you can have knowledge, but I think that when you study science, you have a new layer of understanding of why the magic works. You know,
Exactly.
yeah,
Like in medicine, for example, we knew that if you ingested certain plants, it would cause a lot of the pain to go away. And most of those plants that helped heal, they were disinfectants and stuff like that, like tobacco. If I eat tobacco, I will die because it is poisonous. But if I take the tobacco leaf, chew it up, put it on an open wound, it'll kill the bacteria and the viruses and funguses, but it won't kill my blood. It won't seep into the blood and kill it. I might get a nicotine high, which is very calming and relaxing for anyone who's done nicotine, cigarettes or vaping. And as a result, it cleans and disinfects the wound. Another example of poisonous plants having that effect is belladonna and all those really poisonous, very beautiful plants. Don't touch that. Don't eat that. Don't touch your face if you do it. It can kill you. It can cause a heart to stop. But modern pharmaceutical painkillers are all made out of poisonous flowers. And now that we know the chemical that's at the very base, we can mass produce the chemical without having to grow a bunch of flowers to have the same effect. And we've even harnessed it down, which came from alchemy. Alchemy eventually became modern chemistry. Even though most people think they're one and the same, they're still two different studies. Chemistry is a branch of alchemy.
yeah. It's amazing when you take a look and you see all the modern day stuff that we take for granted that had occult origins in it,
Yeah,
and people just especially Christians and mainstream religion just doesn't realize that at all. Now you mentioned you mentioned about the berserker bloodline, and you and I were talking earlier about that, and can you explain a bit more of what it is, like building up a bunch of rage and then just letting it go? We had touched
so
on that a little bit.
I'll give you the metaphysical side first,
Right.
and then I'll give you kind of my opinion of it because I don't have enough experience with berserkers outside my own family bloodline to
Okay.
give you a full science background of like DNA and stuff like that.
Right.
But the metaphysical story goes in ancient Germanic origins, supposedly when mankind was created, we were given what's called the odor or the breath of life or ecstasy, the ability to feel emotions and stuff like that. And it's basically what gives life flavor. Like if you don't have that, you can't look at the tree and blow in the breeze with the light shining through and go, wow, that's beautiful, or the light bouncing off the lake and go, that's gorgeous. You can't enjoy life without that. Well, for some reason, Odin decided it would be a really good idea to give a couple of human tribes a extra dose. What happens if I add just a shit ton of it in here? And that's how you get berserkers, which come from the bear totem. Those people, when they experience life to such a full degree, they just love everything. They absolutely can't get enough of anything. And because of this, they're so very easygoing. I have met, I want to say, 2 actual berserkers in my life. And they just some of the most down to earth people. Like everything just works for them. Even in ancient origins, no matter where they went, they were unstoppable killing machines, but they were also some of the friendliest people you could ever meet. And when they rage, when they go into that berserker state, they don't remember any of it. It becomes so overpowering that on the etherical level, essentially our energy is swarming through us and it overwhelms us that we become a conduit for magic. And it's been my experience that these 2 berserkers are naturally gifted with magic at a level that only sorcerers should be able to. And after years of practice, but it just comes easily to them because they're just a perfect conduit for it. Then the other version is what my bloodline is, and that's the Ulfathan. And anybody that watches this, I really don't care if they believe it or not. I know what I am. There's a lot of people that think that this is just an excuse to have really toxic masculine energy, or it's just an excuse to be an angry, abusive person. But the truth of the matter is, you're not a berserker if you think that, because berserkers don't like to berserk, which personally could be a contradiction, because as a wolf totem or Ulfathan berserker, it's the reason it's called the ecstasy is because it's just that. There's nothing that really compares to it when it takes over. The rage doesn't come just as anger, it's just most known in stories as anger, and it gives us the ability to just shut off so many different features that most people would.
Is it just a matter of just bottling it up and then just letting it just explode later on? Because from what you tell me, it seems like they're people that are slow to anger in everyday life. Is that true?
Some people are slow to anger. My mom always said that it's basically like a bomb with a fuse, an old school cartoony bomb. Some people just got a longer fuse than others. Some people, it's a straight flintlock. You just push the button and it goes off. But for berserkers, it's not just it goes off. It's like napalm. It spreads, except it's a controlled burn. And for us, a lot of what I've learned studying it is, in old times when we would rage, we would fill people with fear. And a lot of my idea and belief behind that comes from the idea that if you look at how electromagnetic fields work on like the planetary level and how it forms this big apple-like shape, human beings have the same electromagnetic field. And if magic flows into a person in that same way, we're pulling energy directly from underneath us in that same way. When we rage, that field should increase and we pull extra energy, but that means we're pulling from people around us. And the wolf totem berserkers don't go blind when they rage. They're fully aware. Now, you could set any one of us off the same way you could set anybody off. For example, like if I just walk up to any stereotypical Latino male right in front of his mother and just slap his mother, I'm getting my ass beat. It's as simple as that. Like, you just don't do certain things.
Yeah.
Snap. He's off. This could be the most calm, chill guy you've ever met, and I did the one thing that ignites the bomb. It can be the same thing for berserkers, but there are people in my family that have spent our entire life trying to not rage, but it doesn't take away from the internal conflicts that we have. And the reason why we would retreat into the woods as we did in ancient times was because civilization does not want us around, because I don't know how to explain it, because we just don't fit in. what's common sense to normal humans is not common sense to us. It's like, oh, well, this dude is causing a problem. Let's just let's just go off the guy. Boom, remove the problem solved, everybody's happy. You can't just kill people. It's not okay.
Right.
But you just said he's a mass murderer. We get rid of the mass murderer and there's no more murder. Problem solved. It's like, but capital punishment's wrong. It's like, I don't understand what he's saying. Like, that's just an example. There's a lot of other examples that are less brutal.
Right.
But yeah, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, no. That was well explained. Now, on a different note, a different topic, I couldn't, when looking into the Norse magic and mythology, I couldn't help but notice the similarities between Yggdrasil, the tree, and then the similarities between that and the tree of life. You know, combined with the fact that, you know, shamans go to other worlds via a tree.
Right.
Yeah, could you explain a bit about the similarities between the tree of life and Yggdrasil?
Well, interestingly enough, most people who study Norse paganism and Norse Sather or Norse magic of any kind, when they get into looking at the tree of life or Yggdrasil in ours, it actually makes more sense to call it the tree of life and death, because the tree itself is more synonymous with an ancient tree that was worshipped in most Germanic pagan religions of both Celtic and Norse origin, of something called the not the ash tree, the yew tree, which is spelled Y-E-W. And a yew tree is pretty much one of the oldest trees that you will ever find. It doesn't seem to just grow old and die. It just keeps growing. And when it gets to the point where it can't grow anymore, it's because it's too big, it can't sustain its weight, and then a branch will fall off and grow right there. Everything about the tree is poisonous. It's toxic to be around. It actually emits a gaseous vapor that is so bad to breathe that it sends you into hallucinogenic trances. And people would worship the gods under these trees, and they would lay things beneath it. And there's actual archaeological sites where these trees were and are that have bones that, like, dead ancestors, dead animals, and so on, that they would just lay at the tree and leave it an offering, and it would basically feed the tree. And that's interesting because the whole of Norse mythology is based around that cycle of life and death. There's so many similarities between what I've learned about druidic practices from my son who's studying that and what I've learned in this. Because if it's a tree of death, and Odin himself is a god of death, and he hung himself on a tree, and specifically the world tree, most people who actually study think it is a giant yew tree, and then he sacrifices himself to himself on this tree, creating a paradox which granted him the runes through a death-like trance of suffering, which is similar to if you lock yourself in a not parabolic chamber, a sensory deprivation tank. It's simulating death. You can't feel anything. You're free floating. Your body is like, am I alive? Am I dead? It's so determined to see things. It will actually pull from the ether. It will draw things into your mind, because when we get visions, they're coming from somewhere. So if you're blind, you're deaf, and you can't see, hear, or smell anything, your brain is so desperate for sensory input, it pulls from whatever it can, be it your imagination or beyond. And what if putting ourselves in those death-like trances allows us to find things like the runes? And that actually leads, that's a good segue into the runes for this. There is a rather popular form of runes that came out during the World War I, World War II era that actually helped build the occultic beginnings of Nazi Germany. And that's why, yeah, Norse paganism actually does have some roots in that horrible part of history. And that's a good example of what happens if you let the wrong people use magic, which is part of the reason why gatekeeping does exist in the magic field. But at the same time, it's part of the problem with gatekeeping, because if I was to only allow people in that I think are good enough, you see where I'm going with that? Like,
Yeah.
if I'm a bad person and I only let people I think are good enough into my bad practices, you're going to just raise a bunch of bad sorcerers. Whereas if anybody can read it and anybody can play, but if I give any kid a box of matches, well, sooner or later the library is going to burn. So you have to, there's balance required. But with the runes, there was a guy that had surgery done on his eyes. Like, I'm not going to go look up all the names because I'll eat up all your time. But he had surgery done on his eyes, and during this time, he was blind for 30 days. And in that time, this vision came to him, and he wrote down the runes that he found, and there was 18 of them exactly. Very similar to the story of the 18 spells that Odin learned how to cast, and each one of them represents one of those runes. And all those are basically the Icelandic Younger Futhark runes from that story. But in this version, his runes are very similar to a lot of the other variations of runes. And he got these through a vision. And he'd never seen the runes before, never heard of the runes before, and he wrote these down, and he got really heavy into the occult after that. And
well, yeah, go ahead, keep going.
I was going to say that it's very similar to a lot of other cultures where they'll do something called a witch's cradle, where they'll put them in like a burlap sack, blindfold them, and just hang them from a tree or from just a wooden podium. And they'll just hang there for a few days with no food, no water, and sooner or later, something's going to start coming into your brain, and you're going to have visions. Right. When you do, this helps open that, third eye, as many occult practices call it. I mean, in the infamous words of Maynard from Tool, it's prying open your third eye, practically with a crowbar. It is actually required to go through some form of near-death experience in a lot of shamanistic practices to, I guess, be initiated into the occult. And that's not uncommon in Norse practice back then either.
Now, speaking of the runes, let's talk a bit about the, I believe it's called the Web of Weird. Did I say it right?
Yes. Okay. Most people call it the Web of Weird. The proper pronunciation is Word.
Web of Word. Okay. Well, because it seems to have, it's an interesting symbol because is it true that it has all the runes of the Elder Futhark in it?
I think that's a modern interpretation, but a lot of what I've learned about the runes is the runes are supposed to be what make up the fabric of reality. So if you go off of that as a theory, nothing more, because you'll have some people that'll watch this video and go, that's not true. There's no proof of it ever existing like that. There's no transcripts of it. Well, tough shit. Everything was word of mouth back then, and somebody drew a parallel, and that actually makes a lot more sense than it should. If you look at the Web of Weird symbol, and that's just for those of you that don't know, it's 3 lines going down, 3 lines coming this way, and 3 lines coming this way. And if you do look at that, and you look at the old Futhark runes, then, or the Elder Futhark runes, you will see all of those symbols in that symbol of the Web of Weird. I like to think of it as, since the Web of Weird is just this massive tapestry of strings of fate going across the entire universe and all of mankind's storyline, then it's actually quite possible that the runes could just be the different knots, those different entanglements, those different weaves. Because if I was a spinstress or a person who works a loom, I'm going to want to create certain knots to create certain patterns I might even need to use a needle to create those different threads. And based on how that string will weave around the other strings creates different symbols and patterns. And if each one of those runes wrapped around that certain way represents a different type of energy and so on. I mean, case in point, if I have two strings like this and I twist them like this so that they pull, that makes an X. Well, that's Gabo. That X symbol represents the G rune in the Elder Futhark, and that literally means gift. It's also a wedding rune. It's a friendship rune. If I shook your hand and we became friends that day through a transaction of peace and understanding, or just mutual benefaction, or hey, we've got mutual interest. I share a gift with you, you share a gift with me. We're now buddies. We're now friends. We're partners. That's what that means. When two things come together like this, just that motion alone, it just makes sense in my head. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right, but the runes seem to work better for me since I figured that out. And maybe I'm just lucky. I don't know, but I like to personally think that.
Well, I also noticed that similarities between the runes and, let's say, the Hebrew alphabet, where each letter has a specific deep meaning, has a numerical value, where you could take the runes and every rune has very deep meaning, and you can make unique combinations. Like, take for instance, in Hebrew you have the 4 letters of God, Yud He Vav He, whereas in the runes you can make similar, unique combinations. On a different note, there's the land of the giants in Norse mythology.
Jotunheim.
Yeah. And would you say that there's similarities between those giants and the Nephilim?
Maybe. It's actually possible that over time, one story was passed far enough. If you play the telephone game, I'll tell you Johnny has a book in his pocket and it goes around the circle for anybody who's played that game. And when it finally comes back to you, it's Joshua inherited the funds from his grandma. Who the fuck is Joshua? Like, it's, but you got the J, right? So, like, yeah, some of it translated, but maybe the Nephilim from the Bible could have been these giant beings that were told in one way. And over time, that story got retold and retold and retold. However, the Nephilim in the Bible actually have like roles that they play. They act more like the angels that were the messengers and so on of the biblical God, that essentially weren't happy and content with what they had, and they went and took female human wives and they got cast out of heaven for it. And that's where the giants that were born from them came to be, and they were these awful looking creatures that couldn't be satiated. Some of them were cannibals, and depending on which story you took. Whereas the giants in Norse mythology take on a different role. Like, maybe that's just where the terminology started, but then as we're far enough from civilization up north and we're out in the wilds, we're closer to nature. So we just go, what are giants? Like, Mom, Dad, tell me, what is a giant? It's like, oh, a giant is this thing that just like exists and it does stuff. And it's like, well, like thunder. It's like, yeah, that's a good example. Like, thunder is a type of giant. Lightning is a giant. And big weather clouds, that mountain is a giant. Like, these are forces of nature. In Norse mythology, or Norse paganism, I should say, is the Jupiter itself would be classified as a Jotnar. It would be a simple planetoid that emits a lot of its own force. But on this massive creature are other creatures like Galestorm, winds, and hurricanes. Those are types of giants. Some of them are perpetual. Some of them come to be. Some of them eventually die. Some of them just go to sleep, because wind never truly stops blowing on a planet with wind. It wakes up or goes back to sleep. It wakes up and throws a temper tantrum. It goes back to sleep. Like, same thing with the ocean currents. Like, in ancient times, it could have just been simply their way of explaining how nature works. But as we get older, a force is still a force. And giants were not all smart, but they weren't all dumb either. So maybe a star is a type of giant. In fact, all of the Aesir that live in Asgard are all technically Jotnar, but they're a different type of Jotnar. They are giants of the forces of order, not chaos. Chaos is like, well, the kind of rain that will destroy your house versus the kind of rain that will heal your crops.
Right. Right. And also, one thing I wanted to touch on is, unlike Marvel, Thor and Loki, would you agree that they're not really brothers like they portray them in the films?
Oh, absolutely not. Even in Norse lore, Loki has a completely different name for his father. It's not Odin. And his mother's name is Nal, which literally translates to needle in Old Norse and Icelandic. And it's why, me personally, I don't know if this is a wide belief, but I think that Loki's mother would have been one of the Norns or the Fates. Not the three originals, just one of the many that rule over the Fates of the cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
That actually explains why he's able to get in and out of trouble so well, because, hey, mom taught me a couple tricks about how, luck and karma and fate works, so I can kind of overrule that. Whereas Odin, his son Thor, his mother is Jorth, which is Earth. It's the land that you and I stand on.
Mm-hmm.
We call it planet Earth now, but the word that they had for the Earth that we're walking on was Jorth, and that was Odin's mother. And if Odin is the sky god that rules over lightning and thunder, well, he's the protector of our realm. And if you back up, take this from a scientific perspective, the sun fuels our planet's electromagnetic field by throwing its little solar flares at us. We catch that, and the electromagnetic field gets charged. That charge allows us to have protection from cosmic rays. And that electromagnetic field is what causes lightning strikes all over the planet. Sounds like Thor.
Interesting.
And lightning is not just a phenomenon on this planet. It's all over the universe. I guarantee you, when we get out there, light years away, galaxies away, lightning is going to be on other planets, and it will require that same electromagnetic field to shield us from the harmful essence of the universe, aka the giants, the Jotnar, the cosmic chaos.
Very well said. Well, Sionnach, it's been a very interesting conversation. One thing I want to throw out to the people that are watching, Sionnach has a Facebook group called Odins Wolves Kindred, and I will have that link below in the video description. Make sure you click on that, join it, check it out. I'm in that group too, so you'll see me posting in there from time to time. And he has updates and stuff like that, so it's interesting. Just check it out. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. And everyone who's watching, like and subscribe to Dark Sorcery.